As video games continue to become more ambitious in scope with the power of technology available making any vision a reality, titles have continuously pushed themselves to become more realistic. Filling their worlds with numerous tiny details for players to marvel at, we've got dripping with opulence productions like everything Naughty Dog and Rockstar have put out. Well, almost everything. However, despite graphical fidelity or any amount of player interaction being available, there are plenty of tiny details games just haven't got quite right. I'm Scott from WhatCulture.com, and these are 8 tiny details video games always get wrong. Number 8. Shooting barrels of oil or a car's gas tank would not explode. Yep, it's gonna be a list about this kind of stuff. Remember the red barrels craze of the 2000s? Every other shooter had random red barrels next to groups of goons for you to blow up. Grand Theft Auto, Bulletstorm, Resident Evil 6, it went further back to the likes of Doom and GoldenEye, but I digress. Exploding barrels were and sometimes still are a thing, but shooting oil or gasoline would never result in an explosion. A flammable, streaky mess, sure, but not anything close to a damage-dealing airburst that would send NPCs flying. Unless you make a point of using incendiary rounds on a minigun as the Mythbusters did to dispel this whole thing, it just ain't happening. The idea seems to come from Hollywood action flicks, and it certainly belongs in action video games, just don't think about it too much. Number 7. Quivers weren't worn on backs. We all know what an archer is supposed to look like. Bow in hand with a quiver of arrows loaded on their back. It's how these people have been depicted in media for decades, with the likes of Robin Hood being the prime example on the big screen. Likewise, whenever you equip a game character with some arrows of their own, they'll probably have the quiver placed on their back. Much like many other myths spread by the factually inaccurate Hollywood though, quivers were commonly worn on belts at the hip of archers rather than on the back as Robin Hood or Skyrim would have you believe. While back quivers are commonly used in modern archery and were used in some cultures across history, like North America or Africa being examples, it was far more typical for archers to use belt quivers, especially in medieval Europe, as it was a far more practical place to store them in combat situations. Even Kingdom Come Deliverance, which prided itself on being historically accurate to its 15th century Bohemia setting, makes the same mistake of placing the quiver on the character's back. Number 6. Silencers aren't silent. If stealth games like Metal Gear Solid, Splinter Cell, or Hitman have taught us anything, it's that attaching a silencer to a gun means nobody will hear it firing, even if you're wiping out someone stood right next to someone else. As fun and satisfying as it is to take out groups of enemies undetected, the reality of silencers or suppressors isn't how they're represented in games. For starters, releasing the air of the gunshot more slowly means that silencers do reduce the sound of a gunshot's thunderous bang, but nowhere near the level of that familiar sound that we've heard so many times. It will still sound like gunfire, and people will still be able to hear it, likely a few rooms over. Likewise, adding a suppressor to a weapon doesn't have any negative impact on the weapon's range or damage output, Call of Duty. Instead, this decision is more rooted in how multiplayer games balance gunplay than anything realistic. Regardless of real-world inaccuracies, silenced weapons in stealth games are a lot of fun, and I'll take this moment to say that you should all go give Splinter Cell Blacklist another chance. Number 5. Seatbelts do and don't matter. Okay, I'm blaming Saints Row and GTA 4 for this because since playing those games, literally any time I'm hurtling down a highway in any game at speed, I'm waiting for something to hit me and send my driver hurtling out the windshield and across the map instead. The Flatout series made this an awesome game mechanic. Wreckfest has your driver fly off something like a lawnmower if collided with at speed, and replaying the original GTAs has reminded me that Rockstar weren't thinking of any of this stuff back then. If we're talking across the board physics applied to driving though, and the amount of detail in AAA titles where GTA 5 lets you manually move the sunroof or San Andreas lets you pop hydraulics on a lowrider, should you have the option to strap in if you're planning a speedier getaway, or is that just too lame? Number 4. Most cover wouldn't protect you. No, some games have acknowledged the harsh reality of most objects in the world not stopping bullets by making it part of gameplay. Call of Duty Vanguard encourages you to shoot through walls more than ever. Overall though, guns are incredibly powerful, and depending on what the gun is and the ammo used, the stopping power will vary considerably. In video games case, when was the last time you fired something that didn't feel like it could do damage? That increasingly aluminium car you've hopped behind doesn't have the strength to shield you from a hail of bullets. In fact, the engine block is the only part of it that would stop a bullet, just don't expect to drive it afterwards. If a car won't be able to offer protection in a firefight, an overturned table or some office furniture would get shredded. For a playable version of all this, check the immaculate Max Payne 3, where Rockstar essentially applied what would become Red Dead 2's level of detail to an awesome third-person shooter. Number 3. Injuries. This is a weird line to walk. I personally remember Peter Molyneux addressing the fact characters don't get injured in games in the run-up to Fable 2. It's why that game never actually kills you and instead just gives you a scar or some sort of permanent mark when you run out of health, letting you get back up but also visibly showing that combat-worn history over time. Honestly though, how many games deal with injuries? In Metal Gear Solid 3, it could become a nightmare of digging out a bullet every time you got shot, and go one step further and suddenly you're in Far Cry 2 realms of guns jamming and having to take your malaria tablets to make it to the next checkpoint. Naughty Dog's answer in Uncharted's case was actually fascinating, saying that Drake is never really taking damage when the screen starts losing color and going red. Instead, that's a representation of his luck running out. When Nate actually gets hit, he goes down, because bullets in that franchise are actually bullets. Transplant across to something like phenomenal tactics shooter Hell Let Loose though, and bullets being bullets means you need medical aid in an instant if you're standing in the wrong place. Maybe it would simply be too gruesome or anti-gameplay to render or even acknowledge injuries, but considering how much something like The Last of Us is brutally realistic, Joel and Ellie can both soak up hundreds of bullets from beginning to end. Number 2, crowds aren't crowds. The main focus of sports games is, unsurprisingly, recreating the sport itself. Depth of tactics, play styles, physics, etc. are all integral for these games to work. Likewise, generating the atmosphere of these events is also hugely important for any competitive sports title to be effective. While the likes of in-game commentary and the sounds of crowds have improved significantly over the years, the spectators themselves still remain pretty flat and lifeless, with no real glut of animation to convince you there are hundreds or thousands of people watching your every move. Whether it's the same handful of characters performing the same animation over and over again, crowds just don't behave like normal human beings. Big old nerdy gaming question here, but which game has the best crowd, where it actually feels like part of the experience and not just a copy-pasted set of NPCs? And number 1, you wouldn't hear gunfire until after the bullet hits. Another misconception about the laws of physics that we can attribute to Hollywood. Every time a gun is fired on screen, the gunshot is heard before we hear the sound of the bullet hitting its target. However, this is the reverse of what would actually happen. Because bullets travel faster than the speed of sound, the bullet would hit its target before the sound of the gunshot is heard. You can really pick up on this at longer distances. The trope has found its way into the world of video games for decades, but at least for us, there's a logical gameplay reason for it to exist. Sound feedback. When we play something, sound is used to provide feedback for player interactions, and to let us know that we've done something in a game. If there was no immediate audio feedback to our in-game actions, there would be a disconnect between us and our characters. In this case, if you change the order of firing and response around, it would totally break the feel of every online shooter and everything else. And those are just 8 tiny details I guarantee you'll think about for the rest of time. For now, I've been Scott from WhatCulture.com. Please subscribe to the What Culture Gaming podcast, and I'll catch you soon.